And this week, you are focusing primarily on taking your ideas that perhaps you manifested through the ethnogenesis visualization project and turning it into a rough draft. And of course, this week we are also engaging in one-on-one conferences to discuss your topic and maybe to create a sense of focus or emphasis. And I look forward to those. But I also want to provide you some practical information that could help in the creation of this first draft. And so today and Wednesday, I'm going to be providing these more lectures on tips and best practices for writing in this particular genre, which is research-based writing. So today, I want to focus on how to synthesize, document, and cite your sources, because your project, while there's no minimum or maximum source material or cited sources necessary for the project, typically for something with this kind of scope, we have anywhere between 7 to 20 research sources. And that is because we want to be able to combine informations from various sources to somehow verify the ideas that you're attempting to find solution for through the guiding question that inspires the research to begin with, right? And that requires some synthesis, and certainly it requires you to incorporate the data into the project. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today's lecture. All right. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Hopefully you can all see that. So first off, to synthesize is to just bring several pieces of texts together to form information that supports a specific claim. And you're, of course, going to be making an argument based on the guiding question that you have established in your visualization. And, of course, through our subsequent conversation to hopefully specify the question or clarify the question, whatever the case may be. Yeah? And hopefully also by doing all this initial research, you begin to come up with categories based on patterns or themes that you find in an effort to answer the question provided. And of course, the more we research, the more we begin to understand what the guiding question is, and thusly what categories begin to emerge as a result of the research that we do. And that, of course, leads to identifying what are going to be the key points or the main ideas of your eventual paper, which presents the argument that you have come up with as a result of doing the research on this guiding question, right? And in many cases, when we're doing research, we will come across similar points of information. And that's good, because that usually means that if you have multiple sources all communicating a similar idea, that there might be some verifiability to that idea, which of course then goes into perhaps your paper. Yeah? Now, there are different circumstances to synthesis, right? One, of course, is the report. That ideas are communicated through which information is included and how the argument is organized. And that's definitely going to help, right? When you synthesize all of the source material that you find. Even more interesting, of course, is finding the themes and patterns that you're identifying through the various sources that you have encountered through the research. And then, of course, that all leads to the argument itself, right? And your sources are obviously going to be supporting that argument through the triangulation of data, right? The qualitative, the quantitative, and the testimonial. So make sure that you are brushing up on those terms because it's going to be vital to this project, that you're at least considering the triangulation of data as a way to support any of the main ideas that emerge through the synthesis of your research. Yeah? Now, let's say you've done all this research and you've come up with brilliance and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna master this question. I have tons of ideas. It's gonna kick ass. Well, now you have to make sure that that source material that is most relevant, that you feel like is aiding in the determinations that you make based on the research for your argument, are in there, are clarifying, are being utilized as support. Okay? And so we're going to talk about 3 ways that you can integrate source material, which is through quotation, paraphrasing, and summary. Okay? They all have a different function, and they're all necessary for research-based argumentative papers, which is what this one is. Okay? First off, I just want to say that a lot of times developing writers tend to overquote. They tend to bring in their source material, sometimes in the form of whole paragraphs, in order to affirm that indeed they did the research. And a lot of times when developing writers do that, it obfuscates or kind of muddies the argumentative voice that the paper should have. An argumentative paper, 1, is not a book report, and 2, needs to really have the stamp of the voice of the writer and the argument that they're trying to make. And even if that argument doesn't seem evaluative, it's still an argument because you are presenting information in such a way that you're conveying a perspective based on the research you've done. And so it becomes vital that at the forefront of a paper like this, that the author and their voice is being privileged. That is different than opinion, right? Because much of an argumentative paper like this, which of course is espousing opinion to some degree, is primarily analysis. The analysis of the research that's found that supports the position that the author takes. And you have to, through the examination of the research, through the data that you find, you need to somehow articulate how it supports the position. And so that analysis becomes just as vital to the voice as the argument does. Okay? So let's not muddy this idea that authorial voice is just opinion, because it's not. Most of it is indeed the analysis of the data that is found through the research that supports the opinion. Cool? And there are different ways that you can do that, but you need to know them all. The first is quoting. That's the classic, a source material being quoted into a paper and being used as support. Okay? To quote something is to incorporate another source's exact words into the text. Okay? And of course, through quotation marks, you know this. There are specific reasons to quote. One is if it's a memorable statement by one of your sources. Like, you couldn't say it any better. Okay? Or if you're doing testimonial data, you want to use the exact words from the experts that you are quoting from, correct? You don't want to muddy that at all. You want to honor with credibility the statement that they make, and then, of course, analyze it afterwards. Quoting would also be used for statements that cannot be reworded without sacrificing their integrity. And then anything that you want to emphasize, because quotations quite literally lead to that. Most of the time, you only use exact quoting for testimonial data or expert testimonial data, or maybe personal testimonies that would more align with qualitative data, right? Like maybe an interview by an individual who lives in a community that is your subject matter, okay? So that would work. But those are really the only times that you would probably quote at all. Now, what's really important is when you do quote, that you use the ICE method. Introduction, citation, and then examination or explanation. Okay, so it's an acronym, ICE. Introduction, citation, examination, or explanation. Now what I have here is the use of the intro. We also would call that a signal phrase. And it's a lead-in basically to introduce the citation before you actually do the quoting. Yeah? So you can see here in the example, the signal phrase would be, the manipulative Tom Sawyer, having been forced to do his chores, tricks his schoolmate into doing them for him by telling him in a tempting tone, comma, right? So what we're doing is whatever you were talking about prior in your paper, you're introducing the source material in a way that flows. Yeah. Then, of course, you would bring in the actual quotation itself, followed by the citation, which would almost always be author and page number, if there is indeed a page number, or author and title of the work, or author and website, right? But the three elements that are necessary for MLA citation is the author, if there is one, the title of the work, if there is one, and that obviously could be website, right? Page number, if there is one. For short texts, which are less than 4 lines, which should be most of your quoting, it would just be integrated directly into the paragraphs. Yeah? And I have an example here, right? You have the title, you have the author, right? And then if it has a page number, you would put it in the parentheticals at the end. In this case, there is not. So you would just have the author name. You see how it's just kind of integrated directly into the paragraph. I'm not going to go into poetry just because we're not doing that in this case. Then for quoting that's more than 4 lines, you would not integrate it directly into the paragraph. You would actually separate it as I've done below, where you kind of have an interruption in the paragraph with an indented, single-spaced integration of an entire quote. Okay, what we call the block quote. You would use this very rarely. You only want to use it if you absolutely must, because you just have the juiciest of testimonial data. We're talking like it's just so beautiful, so perfect, so integral to supporting your main idea that you must include the entire thing. Okay, this is going to be rare for the kind of research that we're doing. It's usually reserved for like literary analysis, but you might get expert testimony that does indeed shine as support, and you want to include the whole thing. That's where you would do this. Okay. All right. So that is direct quoting. And again, most of it is going to be testimonial, and most of that is going to be expert, right? Where you directly quote as an integration into your paper. Paraphrasing is when you take information from a source and you put it into your own words. And this is so that you continue the flow of your ideas, because you don't need the exact verbiage but you do want to acknowledge that you got it from a particular source, right? So in paraphrasing, the goal here is to take information that isn't vital to being exact and kind of maneuvering it into more of a voice and a style that the rest of your paper is being written in. Okay, so again, it's emphasizing your voice as an author. And I just have what to do and what not to do. What not to do is use wording that's too close to the original text. Why do that? Put it into your own voice as long as you do not ruin the integrity of the information itself. Yeah? And when there is a moment of kind of juicy, well-constructed language in a source that you want to bring in, of course, you just put it into quotes. Yeah? But just because you are paraphrasing doesn't mean that you do not indicate the source. And you would, with the parenthetical use of MLA, you would still incorporate at the end of your paraphrase. Okay? So here is an example, right? This is an original source. Okay? And notice that there's a lot of information in there, right? A paraphrase version would be as such. And I have a good version and bad version for you to review. Yeah? In the good version, it is incorporating a style and a language that doesn't replicate the original source, but feels more authorial. Yeah? And notice in the paraphrase, there is parenthetical citation. In this case, page numbers, right? And the identity of the author, which you want to have. Here's another example, and maybe a better one, okay? And this one's from Reaching for the Sky, which is just an article in a magazine from Ron Bachman. But notice how we have taken information from an original source and kind of truncated it down to its necessary elements, at least for the sake of this particular project. And then at the end, there is the parenthetical of the author and the page number where it's coming from. Sound good? Hopefully that makes sense. Let's make sure that we're still recording. Good. Then we have summarizing. Summarizing is when you just want to capture key ideas, but the details themselves are not important. So you might summarize like a historical document where you're just acknowledging the source material, but you're completely putting it into your own words because there's no need to incorporate any of the material in the way that it's being communicated in the article. Okay, this is for a lot of denotative data that you find, historical documents, quantitative data from a scientific journal, or maybe quantitative data from a sociological journal, as many of you might incorporate for an ethnogenesis article, where you're taking the material, you're completely positioning it into a summarized form that serves your argument and merely identifying where the information is coming from. But by no means, do you really need any of the original text, because it doesn't really verify much on its own, right? It's just about the data. And so you would merely bring in a signal phrase just to kind of identify where the information is coming from, like an institution that has done the scientific study, for example, right? Or that, is an individual who has contributed to a particular argument that you're summarizing. You would mention that information in a signal phrase. But otherwise, you would just communicate the summary and then have your parenthetical citation wherever relevant. Okay. And so lastly, just acknowledging sources. Okay. And I've already kind of mentioned this, but I want to make sure it's clear. Whenever you are doing in-text citation, which is important for MLA, you always want to identify the author in the signal phrase when introducing the source. So according to Joe Blow, in the article, Maya is amazing, comma, and then, of course, bring in the source, whether it's a direct quote, a paraphrase, or a summary. Yeah? This is what a signal phrase is. It's identifying any of the material that's necessary to kind of allude back to what source you are getting it from. Okay? Author is most important. But no matter what, you also bring in the parenthetical at the end of whatever in-text citation you perform. Okay? And the sources that need acknowledgement. Obviously, direct quotations, right? Any material that is not common knowledge that would be arguable, you certainly want to acknowledge the source. Any assertions by others, this would be expert testimony or any kind of testimonial, even if it's qualitative, right? And basically any information that you didn't generate yourself. So you would want to acknowledge the sources of this. And I have down here, when in doubt, cite your source. Always, always, always. Things that don't need acknowledgement in any kind of parenthetical citation. Common knowledge, right? Or widely available denotative information, like Trump is the 45th president of the United States. Yeah? And Biden is going to be the 46th. That's common knowledge. You don't need to cite that, right? You don't need to cite well-known quotations even. Things that are just, again, more common knowledge. Things that wouldn't be kind of up for doubt without the citation information in there. And then, of course, any of your own arguments you wouldn't need to acknowledge. Duh. Okay. And then in this last part, and this, of course, is located in Camino in the supplemental materials for this week, I just have some information on avoiding plagiarism. Okay. What I also have in the supplemental materials for class this week are quotation exercises and quotation examples. If some of you are, maybe you just haven't gotten a lot of training on how to use MLA format for integrating source material into effective citation, I have examples for you because I want to make sure that you don't get too tripped up on this. I don't want you stressing about citation, okay? What's more important is just integrating source material in an effective way. And that is always by identifying what it is, yeah? To always have a signal phrase so that you're introducing the source material after you have made a claim of some kind that requires the source material as support, yeah? Then to cite the source, and then ultimately, and most importantly, to examine the information and to tie it back to the main idea that you are bringing the source material in the first place. And that's what the ICE method is. Introduction, citation, and then most importantly, the E, explanation, right? Explaining how this information comes to support the main idea of the paragraph, which of course overall contributes to the central argument that you're making for the paper. If you do these things, you're in good shape. Because that's what is necessary for integrating source material into a paper. Just, again, keep this in mind. You always want to privilege your own argumentative voice. no matter what. That doesn't mean that you do not include the source material, but you figure out how to incorporate the source material in a way that doesn't detract from your own voice. So, you want to focus on only doing direct quotes when it's absolutely necessary for expert testimony or for interview material, for the most part. You want to incorporate paraphrasing when it's information that espouses an idea, but you don't require it to be in those exact words, right? So that can be also testimonial data, right? Or qualitative information, stories, illustrations, descriptions that you then incorporate into your own words. And then lastly, summarizing, which is going to be more your quantitative data and more observable data that you don't necessarily need to be in the words at all of the source material, and that you can just bring in utilizing your own voice as a way to enhance the understanding and the knowledge of what it is you're discussing. But no matter what, whether it be direct quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing, you are always bringing in the parenthetical citation of your work. And the elements that you want to always consider are the author, whenever relevant, the title of the source, whenever relevant, or website, and page numbers, if indeed there are some. Okay. Make sure that you look at my supporting information if you're still struggling with that. You can also go to a wonderful website which talks about MLA format really well, like how to source material. It has all these tips in it. It's called the OWL Purdue. If you just type in OWL Purdue, OWL is in Purdue, like Purdue University, which is where it comes from. If you type that into your browser, it'll pop up. It is a free sourced database of kind of instructionals on how to incorporate source material in MLA format, and you can consult it for your paper. Okay, so this was kind of highlights of it. And it's not something to memorize anyway, you all. We have repositories for this information. So again, don't get too stressed about it. You need to use it. You need to adhere to MLA format for this paper. But by no means are you needing to memorize it. Now, eventually, the more you do it, the more it will become automatic for you. But for now, just know that you can reference how to do it. You understand why, and that you need to do it for this paper. All right. I look forward to the conferences with you all. I'm excited about them. And good luck composing this paper. On Wednesday, I'm going to give just a few more tips on how to kind of organize the structure of your paper so that you have a lot of tools to use for success. Good luck.